Sherlock Holmes and the Adventure of the Speckled Band. It was early April when my friend and colleague, Sherlock Holmes, welcomed me back to 221B Baker Street after I'd met, at his request, a prospective client.
Well, Watson, you're back later than anticipated. I trust your early morning assignation was successful?
I believe it was, Holmes. I still don't know why you sent me, though.
You know it is not becoming for a young lady to visit a gentleman at his residence. Hence we're sending you to the Mayfair Hotel. I trust Miss Stoner met you there?
She did. Rather charming she was, too.
I do believe, Watson, you are blushing.
Don't be ridiculous, Holmes.
Charming people are one thing, Watson, but in my experience they seldom have the means to pay the fees. Besides, Miss Stoner's initial letter did not grab my attention as a case I should like to pursue.
I think you will change your mind when I tell you of our meeting.
Perhaps.
If you did not see any glimmer of interest in the case, why did you send me to meet Miss Stoner? Well, she was already waiting for me when I got there. She'd been given a seat next to the fire as she was shivering.
It is unnaturally cold for April.
Almost the exact words I said to her. Her response, however, was not at all what I expected.
Go on.
"It is not the cold that makes me shiver," she said. "It's the fear, the terror." Oh, come on, Holmes. I know you. Those words would have grabbed your interest. Do they not cry out to you there's a mystery to be solved?
Tell me all you observed when you first met Miss Stoner.
Well, she was clearly in a state of agitation. Her eyes were restless during our conversation, and she kept looking over towards the door, almost as if she expected to see someone. She looked about 30, but her hair, it was shot with premature grey.
Were you alone in the hotel?
It was quiet, but it was early. A few waiting staff, and another guest sat some distance from us, occupied in his morning newspaper.
And Miss Stoner had travelled from just outside Leatherhead, presumably, given this was the address on her letter.
Yes. She told me she'd set off at 6 and caught the first train to London.
Why did she set off so early?
She was worried about her stepfather's reaction. A Dr. Grimesby Roylott.
Yes, I'm aware of the Roylotts of Stoke Moran. I believe the family was once one of the richest in the country, but that successive heirs to the family fortune have reduced it to a crumbling mansion and a few acres of land.
Yes, and apparently Dr. Roylott is the last surviving member of the family. And a fearsome fellow he is, too. Locals are terrified of him. And from what she said, Miss Stoner is also rather wary of his temper. Then, of course, there are the animals he keeps.
Animals?
Yes. A strange one, but Miss Stoner told me that he allows a cheetah and a baboon free rein of his land. The locals fear them as much as they do the master.
Indeed.
Well, it would appear that Roylott has a passion for Indian animals, a throwback to his days in Calcutta, where he had established a large practice. When he returned to England, he had a correspondent send the animals over to him.
Why did he leave India, if he had established a large practice there?
Well, according to Miss Stoner, Roylott had beat his native butler to death in a fit of rage and narrowly escaped a capital sentence. He did, however, enjoy a long time in prison and returned to England a morose and bitter man.
He sounds like a charming fellow.
And it would seem that imprisonment did little to curb his temper. When he resumed occupancy at Stoke Moran, he began to indulge in ferocious quarrels with whomever might cross his path. Miss Stoner says that violence of temper approaching mania has been hereditary in the men of the family. He'd publicly brawled with several villagers, ending up in the police court. It would seem he is a man of immense strength and absolutely uncontrollable in his temper. Last week, he hurled the local blacksmith into a stream, following an altercation over an unpaid bill. In fact, the only friends he seems to have are a band of gypsies, which he allows to camp on his land.
Interesting. And Miss Stoner's mother?
Died 8 years ago in a railway accident. Miss Stoner and her twin sister were 22 at the time. You see, Dr. Roylott had married Miss Stoner's mother in India. She was the young widow of a major general, and her daughters were only 2 when they married. Mrs. Stoner had a considerable amount of money, no less than £1,000 per year, which she bequeathed to Dr. Roylott whilst the daughters were living with him, with a provision that a certain annual fee should be allowed to each of them in the event of their marriage.
I see. But I'm still not clear. In what exactly is Miss Stoner wishing to gain our help?
Well, she's scared. Terrified, it would seem.
Terrified of what? And pray, be precise.
She's terrified for her own life.
In your opinion, is there any basis to her fear?
From what she said, I should say so. Of course, I tried to comfort her. assured her we would help.
I'm sure you did, Watson.
Really, Holmes, the young lady's engaged to be married.
And before you committed to helping her, did you mention my usual fee?
It was mentioned in conversation.
And?
At present, it's not within her power to reward you for your services, but you see...
Did I not tell you this from her original letter?
In 6 weeks' time, she'll be married and in control of her own income, as stipulated in the term of her mother's will. I believe Miss Stoner to be entirely honest.
Do continue. You were telling me about her fears.
Well, as you can imagine, living with Dr. Roylott was not the most pleasurable experience for Miss Stoner or her sister Julia. They were in a constant state of apprehension about their stepfather's temper. Servants were continually being dismissed. In fact, quite often the sisters ended up doing the chores themselves. Miss Stoner says that at the time of her sister's death, her hair was turning white.
The sister is dead?
Yes, died 2 years ago, in mysterious circumstances. At the time of Julia's death, she was engaged to be married. Roylott had offered no objection to the marriage, but 2 weeks before the wedding was to take place, the terrible incident occurred.
Tell me all she told you. Leave nothing out.
Right. Well, Stoke Moran is a very old manor house, and only one part, the central section, is now inhabited. The bedrooms of this section are on the ground floor. Now, of these bedrooms, the first is Dr. Roylott's, the second, Julia's, or was rather, and the third, Helen's. Miss Stoner's, I mean. There is a small air vent between Julia's old room and Roylott's room, but there are no adjoining doors between the bedrooms. Each bedroom, however, does have its own door that opens out onto the same corridor.
And the windows of these rooms?
All open out onto the lawn.
Your attention to detail is improving, Watson. Please do continue.
Well, on the night of Julia's death, she had gone to her sister Helen's room after the stepfather had retired for the evening. They'd chatted about Julia's upcoming marriage when... At 11 o'clock, Julia rose to leave, but she paused at the door and looked back. Tell me, Helen, I don't suppose you've heard a whistling in the dead of night? Never. And I don't suppose it's possible that you yourself could whistle in your sleep? Certainly not. Why? For the past 3 nights, at about 3 in the morning, I've awoken to this low whistling sound, and I cannot tell where it's coming from. It could be the room next door, it could be the lawn. Well, I have not heard it. It'll be those wretched gypsies. They get everywhere. Yes, but if it did come from the lawn, I wonder why you did not hear it too. I sleep more early than you. Yes. Oh, well. I'm sure it's of no consequence. Good night. Thank you. Well, then, after Julia left, Helen said she locked the door behind her.
She locked the door? Does this not strike you as strange?
With a cheater and a baboon on the loose. Not to mention that band of gypsies, I think it's perfectly understandable.
Perhaps. Pray proceed with your statement.
Right. Well, according to Miss Stoner, Helen, that is, she went to sleep after her sister had left, but was awoken a few hours later by the sound of the wind and the rain outside. Then, amid all the hubbub of the gale, she heard the wild scream of a terrified woman. Miss Stoner sprang from her bed, wrapped a shawl around her, and rushed out onto the corridor. However, when she opened the door, she heard a low whistling sound, just as her sister had described. And then after that, a clanging sound as if a mass of metal had fallen. Well, Helen ran down the corridor. As she did so, she heard her sister's door being unlocked from the inside. Then, by the light of the corridor lamp, she saw her sister, Julia, appear at the door. Her face was blanched with terror. Her hands were groping for help, her whole body swaying to and fro like that of a drunkard, until suddenly her knees gave way and she fell to the floor, writhing in agony as if she was in the most terrible pain. And then she pointed down the corridor and cried, "Oh my God, Helen, it was the band! The Speckled band!" By the time Roylott had arrived, his attempts to revive her were in vain. For she slipped into unconsciousness and died a few minutes later.
The whistle and the metallic sound. Did Miss Stoner swear to hearing them?
She said she's sure as she can be, given the howling of the wind and the creaking of the old house.
Was the sister dressed?
No, she was in a nightdress. And in her right hand there was the charred stump of a match, and in her left hand a matchbox.
Showing that she had struck a light and looked about her when the alarm took place. This is important. And what conclusions did the coroner come to?
Well, he investigated the case with great care, for Dr. Roylott's conduct had long been notorious in the county, but was unable to find any satisfactory cause of death. Miss Stoner's evidence showed that the door of her sister's room had been locked from the inside. The windows, they were blocked by old-fashioned shutters and broad iron bars, which were secured every night. The walls were carefully sounded and were shown to be quite solid all round. The flooring was also thoroughly examined with the same result. The chimney was wide, but was barred by 4 large staples, meaning that, when she met her end, Julia was quite alone, and there were no marks of violence upon her.
Poison?
The doctors examined her for it, but without success.
What is Miss Stoner's theory?
Well, she believes that her sister died of pure fear and nervous shock, although she cannot imagine what could have frightened her that much.
You mentioned gypsies earlier. Were there any on the grounds at the time of Julia Stoner's death?
Yes, there were always some present.
Watson, what did you gather from this allusion to a band, a speckled band?
Perhaps Julia was delirious? Or it could have referred to a band of people, perhaps the gypsies on the plantation. I believe Miss Stoner says that they often wear spotted or speckled handkerchiefs on their heads.
Perhaps. These are very deep waters.
And that's not all, Holmes. Miss Stoner had much more to tell me. Now, if your interest isn't spiked by this, it never will be. She told me...
Don't tell me! Miss Helen Stoner is to be married in the summer to a gentleman she's known for many years. Her stepfather has offered no objection to the marriage. 2 days ago, some repairs were started in the central section of the house. Miss Stoner's bedroom wall was proclaimed unsafe, and so she's had to move into the very chamber in which her sister died, and to sleep in the very same bed. Some nights ago, Miss Stoner lay in bed, struggling to sleep, when suddenly she heard in the silence of the night the same low whistle which had been the herald of her sister's own death. She sprang up and lit a lamp, but nothing was to be seen in the room. She was too shaken to go back to bed, however, so she quickly dressed and wrote this letter to myself, which I received a few days later, and which precipitated your meeting this morning.
Even for you, that level of knowledge is impossible. Unless
I was actually present at your meeting?
The other guest at the hotel. The one absorbed in his newspaper.
The morning news can become so tedious when read for the 8th time.
Then why on earth have you let me repeat the very story that you yourself observed?
Hearing you relate the story has proved invaluable. It has confirmed that my understanding was factually correct.
Really, Holmes? This really is off, you know?
I beg your pardon, Watson. I had concluded from the original letter that Miss Stoner was a guarded person. Her tone suggested she was fearful. I've witnessed how you talk to people. It is your bedside manner, no doubt. I sometimes feel people open up more to you than myself.
Thank you.
Of course, I could not really trust you to go alone, as you would invariably have missed vital evidence.
Such as?
5 little spots, the marks of 4 fingers and a thumb, were printed upon her wrist. Clearly, her anxiety about her stepfather was not confined to his words.
Thought I'd been thorough. How on earth did you notice that?
Oh, she had tried very carefully to hide them, but they were visible momentarily on each occasion she picked up the cup and saucer and raised the drink to her lips, and when she raised her hand for her companion to kiss it.
Yes, well, we know that her father has a temper. Obviously, he doesn't know his own strength.
And Miss Stoner's frequent glances towards the door? Clearly, she was terrified of someone seeing her, and the facts all point to this being Grimesby Roylott.
You suspect him of foul play?
We must, for the time being, separate fact from feeling. Being a bully does not necessarily mean he is implicated in the sister's death.
Oh, Holmes, I'm afraid I have a confession to make. I did tell Miss Stoner I would visit the family home this afternoon just to see things with my own eyes, and she seemed so distressed.
Yes. I overheard you. Well done, Watson. It saves me the bother of arranging such a visit myself. I, of course, shall accompany you. Now, if I overheard correctly, Miss Stoner will be there by 2 o'clock, and her father is expected to be away until 4. That gives us sufficient time to look at the bedrooms in the house. Now, Watson, before we catch the train to Leatherhead, I have a fact-finding mission for you in town. I've written down the details, and I shall meet you at the station. This is a dark and sinister business. If the lady's correct in saying that the flooring and walls are sound, and that the door, window, and chimney are impassable, Then her sister must have been alone when she met her mysterious end. The Speckled Band. The Speckled Band.
Out of my way!
What the devil?
Are you Holmes?
My name, sir. But you have the advantage of me.
I am Dr. Grimesby Roylott of Stoke Moran.
Oh, pray, take a seat, Doctor.
I'll do nothing of the sort. I know that my stepdaughter wrote to you. I traced her to the hotel. What has she been saying to you?
It is unnaturally cold for the time of the year.
What has she been saying to you?
But I hear that the crocuses promise well.
Try to put me off, do you? I've heard of you before. You are Holmes, the meddler. Holmes the busybody. Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
Your conversation is most entertaining. Close the door on the way out, for there is a decided draught.
I will go when I have had my say. Don't you dare meddle in my affairs. I'm a dangerous man to fall foul of, Holmes. You have been warned.
What a cheek. To confound me with the official detective force.
After obtaining the information Holmes had asked for, we caught the 12 o'clock train to Leatherhead. About 1:30, we were sitting in a cart that took us through the meandering country lanes on the final part of our journey to Stoke Moran. The sun shone, but the day was still cold, and I reflected on the strange contrast of the sweet promise of spring and the sinister quest in which we were engaged. It seems from what you've said, this Roylott really is a threat.
Yes, a very amiable fellow. Did you get the information I asked for?
Yes. So I visited the College of Civilians and I've seen the woman's will. Now, the total income, taking into account the investments in today's prices, is £750 per year. Now, each daughter, Helen and Julia, could claim an income of £250 a year in the case of their marriage.
If even one of his stepdaughters were to be married, Roylott would be left with a relative pittance. Hardly sufficient to run a large country house. It proves he has the strongest possible motive for standing in the way of his stepdaughter's marriage.
What's your theory then, Holmes?
When you combine the ideas of whistles in the night, the presence of a band of gypsies who are on intimate terms with this old doctor, the fact that we have every reason to believe that the doctor has an interest in preventing his stepdaughter's marriage, the dying allusion to a band, and finally the fact that Miss Helen Stoner heard a metallic clang which might have been caused by one of those metal bars that secure the shutters falling back into place, I think that there is good ground to think that the mystery may be cleared along those lines.
But what of the band of gypsies?
In all honesty, Watson, I do not know. My deductions and observations are not yet sufficient to form a robust theory. I'm hoping that by seeing the house itself, my theories may be compounded. Did you pack your revolver?
Certainly did, Holmes. Truth be told, I do not like the sound of this Dr. Roylott. And that's before we even take into account the cheetah and the baboon.
Yes, I'd forgotten those.
To our right, we saw a woodland park, stretched up a gentle slope. From amid the branches, we could just about make out the grey gables of a very old mansion. Stoke Moran.